My name is Elena Ward. I'm in my late 30s, a mother, a professional, and, at least on the surface, someone most people would describe as steady, dependable, calm to the point of being forgettable. I've spent most of my adult life being seen as the woman who keeps things running without asking for credit, the one who smooths tension before it ever becomes visible. People often mistake calm for softness, or worse, for a lack of awareness. I've been underestimated in rooms where I was the most prepared person present. I've been spoken over, decided for, and quietly categorized as safe, not threatening, not reactive, someone who would absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. This story isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It isn't about revenge, exposure, or public spectacle. And it isn't about shouting the truth until someone finally listens. It's about watching a line get crossed and choosing not to announce that I noticed. The experience I'm about to share unfolded over years, not weeks. It began with small moments most people would dismiss as misunderstandings. It moved through long stretches of silence that looked like patience from the outside. And it ended, not with chaos, but with clarity. At the center of it is something I never imagined would happen to me. My spouse brought his affair partner to our child's school event, not in secret, not by accident, but openly enough that the message was unmistakable, even if no one said it out loud. Some lines should never be crossed. This is not a story where I suddenly became powerful overnight. There were no clever traps, no cinematic reveals, no villain monologues. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped protecting narratives that were never protecting me. And I stopped playing the role I had been assigned without my consent. What you'll hear is a first-person account of how emotional justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives through restraint, through documentation, through timing, through the decision to let people fully step into the consequences of their own assumptions. I'm sharing this because I know how many people live inside similar silences. People who are told explicitly or implicitly that staying calm means staying powerless, that if you don't react, nothing changes. This is a documentary style telling, honest, measured, without exaggeration. I won't glamorize pain, and I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. What I can promise is that every choice I describe was deliberate and legal, ethical, and grounded in my own moral code. If you've ever been quietly dismissed by someone who thought you would never move, never choose yourself, never redraw the boundaries, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized someone underestimated you only after it was already too late for them to undo it? For a long time, I was easy, not in the way people usually mean it, but in the way that makes you convenient to underestimate. I was the wife who remembered schedules without writing them down, the mother who never missed a permission slip, the professional who fixed problems before they reached anyone important enough to care. At school events, teachers smiled at me with recognition, but rarely asked my opinion. Other parents assumed I had time, My husband assumed things would simply be handled, and I handled them. I didn't demand attention. I didn't narrate my exhaustion. I didn't correct people when they forgot I had already solved the issue they were now discussing, as if it were new. There was a rhythm to my invisibility, and I kept pace with it because that's what capable women are taught to do. Make competence look effortless so no one feels threatened by it. To my husband, I was reliable, solid, predictable, the kind of person you don't check in on because you assume she's fine. Our marriage, at least from the outside, looked stable, not passionate, not volatile, just functional. And in his mind, functional meant finished, a system that no longer needs maintenance. At school, I was our child's mom, not Elena, not someone with a professional background in operations and risk assessment. Just the woman who volunteered when forms went out and stayed late to stack chairs. People smiled warmly, then turned away to speak to someone louder. I noticed these things. That's important to say. I wasn't oblivious. I simply didn't react in ways people recognize as resistance, because reacting would have meant explaining myself. And I was tired of explaining. There's a particular kind of erasure that happens when you are calm in situations where others expect emotion. When you don't raise your voice, people assume you don't feel. When you don't confront immediately, they assume you didn't understand. When you don't object, they assume consent. Over time, I realized that many people weren't misreading me by accident. They were reading me in the way that best suited them. My husband read my patience as permanence. My silence is forgiveness. My steadiness is a lack of options. And I let him, not because I believed it, but because I was watching. I had learned, through years of work and motherhood, that systems reveal themselves when you stop interfering. That people show you exactly how far they will go when they think there's no cost. And that the roles you are assigned become prisons only if you forget they were never chosen by you in the first place. To everyone else, I was the background, the dependable constant, the woman who would keep things civil, keep things moving, keep things quiet. What they didn't see, what they never bothered to look for, was that I was always paying attention, not with suspicion, with clarity. I knew how decisions were being made without me. I knew when my presence was taken for granted. I knew when respect was being replaced by assumption. And I knew when affection quietly expired and was replaced by entitlement. I didn't announce that awareness. I stored it because I wasn't interested in changing how they saw me. Not yet. I was interested in understanding the full shape of the role they had decided I would play, the limits they believed I had, the lines they believed were safe to cross. There's power in being underestimated, but only if you recognize it before it recognizes you. At that point in my life, I still believed things could correct themselves, that clarity would arrive before damage, that my restraint would be matched with consideration. That belief would not survive what came next. But in this part of the story, I was still who they thought I was, the quiet wife, the capable mother, the woman who would never make a scene. And because of that, they felt safe doing things they never would have tried with someone louder. They forgot that silence is not the same as absence, and calm is not the same as consent. The first moment didn't arrive with shock. That's what makes it easy to dismiss. It was small, socially defensible, something that could be explained away if anyone chose to explain it at all. And because of that, it lodged itself deeper than a dramatic betrayal ever could. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of weekday that blurs into routine. My husband came home later than usual, not alarmingly late, just late enough to feel intentional. He didn't offer an explanation right away. He never did when he thought one wasn't required. We were standing in the kitchen. Our child was in the living room, humming softly while building something on the floor. The house felt neutral, safe, ordinary. He mentioned casually that he'd run into someone from work, and they'd talked longer than expected. He said her name, not with emphasis, not with hesitation, just easily, as if it were a name I already knew, as if I should. I remember nodding, not because I approved, but because I was registering the detail. The way he didn't look at me when he said it, the way the sentence was structured, was to close the subject, not open it. It wasn't jealousy that stirred in me. It was something quieter and colder, recognition. Over the following weeks, her name surfaced again, inconveniently, inconsistently, always just enough to normalize her presence without explaining it. A shared joke I wasn't part of, a reference to what she said about a project, a comparison, lightly framed as admiration. Each time, the room stayed calm. My voice stayed even. I didn't ask questions that would give him the opportunity to lie better. I didn't confront, because confrontation assumes the other person is prepared to be honest. What I felt instead was the first small cut of disrespect, not the affair itself. I didn't know that yet, but the assumption that I would absorb these references without reaction, that my emotional labor included making space for a third presence in my marriage, even before she officially existed in it. What struck me most was how invisible the moment was to everyone else. Friends we saw during that period noticed nothing. Our child noticed nothing. Even I outwardly noticed nothing. Life continued. Meals were made, homework was checked, schedules were kept. But internally, a line had been brushed, not crossed, brushed, as if someone were testing how close they could come without consequence. I didn't flinch, and that, I think, is when he learned the wrong lesson. He learned that my silence meant comfort, that my lack of immediate reaction meant acceptance, that I was, as always, managing the emotional temperature of the room so he wouldn't have to. What he didn't learn, what he couldn't see, was that I had begun separating observation from tolerance. I started remembering exact phrasing, dates, context, not in a paranoid way. In the same way, I document patterns at work when something doesn't align with the process. Calmly, methodically, without emotion clouding accuracy. I remember thinking very clearly, if this is nothing, it will resolve itself. And if it isn't, it will reveal itself. That was the moment I stopped giving him the benefit of my doubt and started giving myself the benefit of my attention. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't demand care, but it changed how I stood. And sometimes that's all it takes. Disrespect rarely arrives as an event. It arrives as a pattern you're encouraged to explain away. After that first small cut, nothing explosive happened. There were no sudden absences, no locked phones, No dramatic shifts in behavior that would have justified alarm. What changed instead was tone, assumption, the slow repositioning of me from partner to background fixture. Her name became familiar enough that not reacting to it felt expected. When I didn't ask questions, he stopped offering context altogether. Conversations shortened. Eye contact softened into something distracted. Decisions were made and communicated, not discussed. And I told myself the same things many people tell themselves when they sense something is off, but don't yet want to name it. He's stressed. I'm overthinking. This phase will pass. I rationalized my quiet as maturity, as emotional intelligence, as choosing peace over paranoia. But there's a difference between choosing peace and being slowly trained to accept less. I noticed how often my needs were deferred with vague promises, how my contributions were assumed rather than acknowledged, how I became the default caregiver, planner, and emotional buffer, while his time grew increasingly protected, increasingly unavailable. At school events, he started arriving separately, sometimes late, sometimes not at all. When he did attend, he stood slightly apart, phone in hand, as if he were elsewhere even when physically present. Other parents smiled at us as a unit, and I returned the smile automatically. It was easier than explaining the growing distance that had no visible source. And still, I stayed quiet. Part of that silence came from habit. Part of it came from hope. And part of it came from a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. I was already being treated as though my discomfort was an inconvenience, so I minimized it. When he forgot an important date, I adjusted. When he dismissed a concern with, "You're reading too much into it," I stepped back. When he spoke about her, now a colleague, now a friend, with a familiarity that edged into intimacy, I noted the language and let the moment pass. Each time I chose not to challenge him, something subtle happened. The behavior didn't correct itself. It advanced. Disrespect, when unchallenged, doesn't pause out of gratitude. It escalates out of confidence. What's difficult to explain is that I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid of acting on incomplete information. I needed to know whether this was thoughtlessness or intent. So I watched. I watched how often he defended her perspectives without being asked. How quickly he became irritated when I needed reassurance. How my calm was no longer met with appreciation, but with entitlement. And in watching, I began to understand the role I had been eased into, the stable base from which he could explore instability elsewhere. I was the constant that made his risk feel safe. That realization didn't come with tears. It came with a quiet, internal recalibration, a recognition that my silence was no longer protecting harmony. It was protecting his comfort. Still, I didn't confront. Not because I was weak, but because I was collecting clarity. There is a moment in many relationships where disrespect stops being accidental and starts being rehearsed, where someone tests what they can do without consequence and then adjusts accordingly. By then, the disrespect had become normal enough that challenging it would have made me seem disruptive. And that perhaps was the point. It took longer than I'd like to admit to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just neglect. It was a role assignment. Somewhere along the way, without a conversation and without my consent, I had been placed into a category that served everyone else well. I was the stabilizer, the administrator of daily life, the person who absorbed the inconvenience so others didn't have to adjust. At home, that role looked like quiet efficiency. I handled logistics. I anticipated needs. I adjusted my schedule to accommodate his unpredictability. When something went wrong, I fixed it before it reached him. At school, it looked like reliability. Teachers emailed me first. Other parents asked me for updates. I was trusted to remember details, to coordinate, and to smooth things over when plans changed. No one asked whether I wanted that responsibility. It was simply assumed I would carry it. And the more seamlessly I performed the role, the more invisible it became. My husband no longer saw me as someone whose emotional state needed consideration. I was the infrastructure. You don't check in with infrastructure. You only notice it when it fails. What made this realization painful wasn't the workload. It was the erasure. I wasn't being disagreed with. I was being bypassed. Decisions that affected our family were presented as conclusions. My opinions were acknowledged with nods, then quietly overridden. When I expressed concern, it was framed as an overreaction. When I stayed calm, it was framed as an agreement. There was no version of my response that altered the outcome. And that's when I understood something crucial. This role wasn't temporary. It was convenient. I was useful in my predictability, safe in my restraint. And because I didn't demand emotional reassurance, it was assumed I didn't need it. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all looked from the outside. We didn't fight. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't create scenes. Friends admired how easy our relationship seemed, how balanced, how mature. They didn't see the imbalance because I was compensating for it. And I was very good at compensating. I began to recognize how often people, especially women like me, are praised for qualities that quietly limit them. Patience, understanding, strength, all admirable traits until they become expectations rather than choices. My husband expected me to be understanding about his distance, strong enough to manage without him, patient enough not to ask questions that would disrupt his equilibrium. And I fulfilled those expectations right up until I didn't. But at this stage of the story, I was still performing, still meeting the role's requirements, still protecting the image of stability even as the foundation shifted beneath it. What changed internally was not my behavior, but my awareness. I stopped seeing my role as a reflection of my worth. I started seeing it as a position others benefited from. And once you see that clearly, you begin to ask a different question. Not, why am I being treated this way? But, who does this serve? That question would guide every choice I made next. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a discovery or a confrontation or a dramatic reveal. In fact, nothing outwardly significant happened at all. That's what made it so definitive. It was a school afternoon, ordinary in every visible way. Our child had a small performance, nothing elaborate, just a brief presentation in the school auditorium. Parents filtered in with phones in hand, whispering, smiling, adjusting coats. I arrived early, as usual, found a seat, smoothed the program on my lap. I noticed my husband wasn't there yet. I wasn't surprised. I scanned the room in that idle, observational way you develop when you're used to waiting. That's when I saw her, sitting 2 rows ahead, laughing softly with another parent, relaxed, comfortable. I recognized her immediately, not from certainty, but from pattern. The way her presence made sense of months of partial truths. She wasn't hidden. She wasn't nervous. She belonged there. And then my husband walked in. He didn't look for me. He walked directly to her. He leaned in, spoke quietly, sat beside her. In that moment, something inside me went completely still. There was no rush of emotion, no heat, no disbelief, just a clean internal acknowledgement. This is intentional. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was a choice, one made in a public space connected to our child, where my presence was not just known, but expected. Some lines should never be crossed. I didn't stand up. I didn't leave. I didn't react in any way that would draw attention. I watched the stage. I clapped when appropriate. I smiled when our child looked out into the audience. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. Because what he did in that room wasn't just an act of betrayal, it was an assessment. He was testing whether the role he had assigned me still held, whether I would stay silent, whether I would absorb the humiliation quietly, the way I had absorbed everything else. And in that moment, I decided something with absolute clarity. I will never explain myself to someone who believes I don't exist. That was the end of confusion, the end of hoping things would self-correct, the end of assuming my restraint would be reciprocated with respect. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was precision. I stopped wondering what was happening and started deciding what would happen next. I didn't confront him that day, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have centered his comfort, his explanations, his version of events. I wasn't interested in that anymore. I was interested in alignment between my values, my actions, and my future. When the performance ended, I hugged our child, spoke kindly, walked out calmly. I didn't look in his direction, not out of spite, but because he was no longer relevant to my internal decision-making. That was the day something shifted, not in the room, in me. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, an attempt to keep peace, to avoid unnecessary disruption. Now, it was deliberate, chosen, controlled. I didn't withdraw abruptly. I didn't alter my routines in ways that would raise suspicion. On the surface, I remained exactly who I had always been, calm, functional, present. But internally, I was no longer participating in the same relationship. I stopped filling in the gaps he left behind. If he forgot something, I let it remain forgotten. If he arrived late, I didn't adjust timelines to accommodate him. I responded politely, briefly, without emotional cushioning, and he didn't notice. That's important. He didn't notice because he had grown accustomed to my emotional labor being invisible. The absence of it felt like neutrality, not withdrawal. My silence, once taken for granted, was now mistaken for resignation. This misinterpretation gave me space, space to think clearly, space to observe without reacting, space to decide my next steps without interference. I paid attention to how often he checked his phone. to how his explanations had shifted from vague to defensive, to how he spoke about the future without including me in it. And still, I said nothing, not because I lacked words, but because I was done offering them for free. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not emptiness. It's a container. It holds intention. It allows truth to surface without being chased. I began preparing, not emotionally, but practically. I reviewed documents, I noted patterns, I ensured I understood the full scope of our shared responsibilities and assets. None of this was rushed. There was no urgency fueled by panic. I moved at a pace that matched my values. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning independence. What others saw was a woman staying calm in the face of disrespect. What they didn't see was that I had stopped negotiating with a reality that no longer served me. My husband, for his part, seemed relieved. My lack of confrontation confirmed his assumptions. He grew bolder in his absence, less careful with his time, and in doing so, he revealed more than he realized. Silence didn't weaken me. It clarified everything. What they never noticed was how much information people give away when they believe they're safe, when they believe no one is watching, when they believe silence means ignorance. I didn't suddenly become secretive. I didn't lock files or whisper on phone calls. I continued my routines exactly as before. The difference was internal. I shifted from participating to recording. At work, this was second nature to me. You don't manage complex systems by reacting emotionally. You map them. You identify dependencies. You document behavior over time until patterns become undeniable. I applied the same discipline to my life. I started keeping quiet notes, dates, changes in routine. Financial irregularities are small enough to be dismissed individually, but meaningful in aggregate. Shared expenses that no longer aligned with shared priorities. Time allocations that didn't match explanations, not obsessively, methodically. I didn't search his phone. I didn't follow him. I didn't interrogate. I let consistency, or the lack of it, do the work for me. What struck me most was how little effort he made to hide anything once he believed I had accepted my role. He spoke more freely. He assumed I wasn't listening. He underestimated how closely calm people observe. The affair itself, when it became unmistakable, didn't shock me. It fit too neatly into the structure I had already documented. The emotional betrayal had preceded the physical one by months. What surprised me was the entitlement. He spoke about his life as though it were divisible, one version for responsibility, another for desire, without considering the cost to the people anchoring it. He assumed I would continue to provide stability while he explored disruption. And because I didn't protest, he assumed consent. At school, the situation grew more audacious. She appeared more frequently, not always beside him, but never far. Their presence together became a quiet fact, visible enough to register, ambiguous enough to deny. No one said anything to me. That silence from others mirrored my own former silence, and it taught me something uncomfortable. People often notice more than they admit, but they wait to see who will enforce boundaries. They were watching to see what I would tolerate. I noticed how administrators addressed me with polite sympathy, without naming anything. How a teacher paused before mentioning schedules that included both of them. How other parents avoided eye contact, then smiled too brightly. Everyone felt the imbalance. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it, so I let them keep watching. Meanwhile, I prepared. I consulted quietly. I ensured my understanding of options was precise, not hypothetical. I gathered what I needed without alarming anyone. I didn't rush because rushing would have exposed intent. And intent at that stage was still private. What they never noticed was that by the time the affair felt out in the open to them, it had already stopped being the center of my decision-making. The betrayal was information, not the injury. The injury had occurred much earlier, when respect was replaced with assumption. Everything after that was simply evidence. The private reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no shaking, no sudden rush of certainty, no moment where I sat down and whispered, "So this is it." By the time the truth became undeniable, it had already integrated itself into my understanding of the situation. What happened instead was quieter and more final. I was reviewing routine documents one evening, the kind of administrative task no one finds dramatic. Statements, schedules, shared obligations, things I had always managed because I was better at details. That's when the last ambiguity disappeared. It wasn't a message or a photo. It was alignment. Dates are lining up too cleanly. Expenses were categorized just carefully enough to avoid notice. Commitments adjusted around a pattern that no longer required explanation, because explanation had stopped being offered. The realization landed gently, like a file sliding into its correct folder. This isn't confusion. This is concealment. And with that understanding came something unexpected. Relief. Relief that I no longer had to weigh possibilities. Relief that my instincts hadn't betrayed me. Relief that I could stop negotiating with doubt and start acting from clarity. I didn't confront him. Not that night, not the next, not at all. Confrontation would have turned the private reveal into a performance. It would have invited justification, minimization, and revision. And I had no interest in managing his emotions through his own wrongdoing. Instead, I sat with the information. I let myself feel exactly what I felt, without amplifying it, without suppressing it. There was sadness, yes, and disappointment, but there was also a deep sense of alignment, as if my internal compass had finally locked into place. This wasn't about catching him. It was about understanding my position. The affair didn't make him powerful. It made him predictable. And predictability is not leverage. It's vulnerability. What I had now wasn't ammunition. It was clarity. And clarity changes how you move through the world. I began adjusting my internal timelines, not for exposure, not for punishment, but for separation. Emotionally first, then structural. I stopped imagining outcomes where he would suddenly understand the harm. I stopped rehearsing conversations I would never have. I stopped waiting for remorse to appear on its own. Because once a line like that is crossed so publicly, so deliberately, repair is no longer mutual. It becomes theoretical. And I don't build my life on theories. The private reveal didn't harden me. It steadied me. It allowed me to proceed without hesitation, without second guessing, without the need to be seen as reasonable by someone who had already decided I was optional. From that point on, every action I took was informed by one simple truth. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. There is a moment after clarity where you are tempted to rush, to act quickly, to reclaim control by making something happen. I felt that pull, briefly, the desire to end the uncertainty with a single, decisive move, a conversation, a declaration, a door slammed shut, but I didn't move yet. Because the decision in front of me wasn't whether to act, it was how. Once you truly understand a situation, your options become painfully clear. I could confront him immediately and force a reckoning built on emotion. I could expose the affair publicly and let social pressure do the work. I could stay, negotiate, bargain for a version of the relationship that required me to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than I already had been. Each option came with its own narrative. Each would have satisfied someone else's idea of what strength looks like. None of them aligned with my values. I asked myself a different question, one I'd learned to ask in professional crises when stakes are high and visibility is low. Which choice preserves my integrity, even if no one applauds it? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was irreversible. I decided that I would disengage completely, emotionally, strategically, and eventually legally, without making my internal process public. I would not ask him to choose. I would not issue ultimatums. I would not wait for apologies that might come too late or not at all. I chose a path that didn't depend on his awareness or cooperation. That decision came with grief, real grief, not for the relationship as it was, but for the version of myself that had believed patience alone could protect dignity. I allowed myself to feel that loss privately, without turning it into performance. What I did not feel was doubt. The line he crossed at our child's school event made something non-negotiable. That space was supposed to be safe, neutral, grounded in care for someone who didn't get a say in any of this. By bringing his affair partner there, he didn't just disrespect me. He revealed that his sense of entitlement outweighed his sense of responsibility. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. So I chose the option that required the most restraint and offered the least immediate satisfaction. The option that would unfold quietly over time. The option that would protect my child, my future, and my sense of self, whether or not anyone ever understood it. That was the decision point, not a moment of rage, a moment of resolve. From then on, everything I did followed that decision with calm precision. Once the decision was made, movement became simple. Not easy, but simple. I didn't announce a change. I didn't signal a shift. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared altered. I still attended school events, still managed routines, still spoke to my husband with the same measured politeness. That continuity was intentional because when people sense a transition before it's complete, they interfere out of guilt, fear, or self-interest. Silence gave me the freedom to move without resistance. I consulted professionals quietly, asked precise questions, listened more than I spoke. I learned what steps could be taken without escalation and which ones required timing. I organized the documents I had always managed, this time with purpose. I clarified boundaries in writing, not conversation. I separated emotional closure from logistical preparation. There was no secrecy involved, only discretion. I ensured my financial understanding was exact. I reviewed shared responsibilities with an eye toward sustainability rather than habit. I made choices that would look neutral in the moment and intentional in retrospect. And still, no one noticed. My husband continued as before, comfortable, confident in my passivity. He interpreted my calm as acceptance, my lack of confrontation as fatigue. That misinterpretation was not my responsibility to correct. At school, the dynamic shifted subtly. I adjusted schedules so I was no longer dependent on his availability. I communicated directly and efficiently. I reduced the points of contact that required explanation. All of this happened without conflict. That's the part people rarely believe, that significant change can occur without visible disruption. That you can reposition your life without announcing your departure. But when your actions are aligned, you don't need validation. Moving in silence wasn't about deception. It was about dignity, about refusing to center someone who had already removed himself from mutual respect. I didn't disappear. I restructured, and in doing so, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd been giving away for years: agency. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. At first, nothing seemed different to him. That's what made the shift so effective. The routine still functioned. The house still ran. Our child was still cared for, supported, and protected from adult fractures. But the invisible support structures he had relied on, without ever acknowledging, were no longer quietly compensating for his choices. When a deadline was missed, it stayed missed. When a responsibility was overlooked, it wasn't rescued at the last minute. When something required coordination, it was handled without him, or not at all. And slowly, discomfort crept in. He began asking questions framed as confusion rather than accountability. Did you remind the school about? I thought you were handling. Why wasn't this taken care of? I answered plainly, factually, without defensiveness. I didn't. I wasn't involved in that. I made other arrangements. There was no accusation in my voice, no edge, just reality stated without cushioning. At school, the social atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The presence of his affair partner no longer carried the same ease. Logistics became awkward. Questions were redirected. Administrators began copying me on communications again, carefully, neutrally, but with renewed attention. When systems adjust, people feel it before they understand it. My husband grew unsettled, not because he understood what was happening, but because something he depended on had gone quiet. The stability he assumed was automatic now required effort. The predictability he took for granted was no longer guaranteed. He didn't confront me. Not yet. Instead, he hesitated, checked in more frequently, attempted small gestures that felt out of sync with the reality he had created. He sensed loss without being able to name it. That's the nature of consequences that arrive without drama. They force reflection. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct his interpretations. I didn't step in to ease the discomfort. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the process he had initiated himself. For the first time, he was experiencing life without my silent reinforcement. And for the first time, I was experiencing peace without needing his awareness. The balance had shifted, not violently, not publicly, but decisively. By the time he realized something was wrong, It was already too late to fix it the way he wanted to. The first sign wasn't remorse, it was panic. Panic has a different texture than regret. It's less reflective, more self-focused, concerned not with harm caused, but with comfort lost. He began paying closer attention to my movements, asking questions that came a few steps too late, not about how I felt, but about what I was doing. There was a new urgency in his voice when he spoke about the future. Plans he hadn't cared about before suddenly mattered. Schedules he had ignored now required coordination. He spoke in hypotheticals, testing whether the structure he relied on was still intact. I responded politely, consistently, without revealing anything. That ambiguity unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He attempted repair in familiar ways, gestures that once would have reassured me, extra presence, casual kindness, comments about us that felt disconnected from recent reality. What he never did was acknowledge the line he crossed, not the affair, not the school event, not the public nature of the disrespect. He circled the damage without naming it, hoping resolution could be reached without accountability. And that's how I knew my decision had been correct. Because repair without recognition isn't repair, it's avoidance. At one point, he asked me directly if something was wrong. I paused before answering, not for effect, but because I wanted to speak precisely. I'm clear about what I'm doing, I said, and I'm at peace with it. That answer frightened him. Clarity does that when it's no longer negotiable. He grew restless, defensive, confused by the absence of emotional cues he could respond to. I wasn't angry. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't offering reassurance. I had moved beyond the stage where his understanding was required. By then, the consequences were no longer forming. They had formed. Systems had adjusted. Options had narrowed. Momentum had shifted away from him. Whatever chance there had been to address things early, to act with humility, to protect our child from unnecessary exposure, to treat me as an equal partner, had passed quietly while he assumed it would always be available. It wasn't. And the most difficult truth, for him, not for me, was that nothing catastrophic had to happen for the ending to become inevitable. He didn't lose me because of one mistake. He lost me because he crossed a line he didn't believe I would enforce. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no locked doors, no audience. By then, I had learned that the most disarming thing you can bring into a confrontation is calm that isn't performative. Calm that doesn't seek agreement. Calm that doesn't need to be validated. He asked if we could talk. I agreed. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where years earlier he had first mentioned her name, casually, as if it were nothing. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but I didn't comment on it. He spoke first. He talked about confusion, distance, how things had felt off. He said he didn't understand when the shift had happened. I listened without interrupting, not because I was trying to be gracious, but because I was no longer emotionally invested in steering the conversation. I wasn't there to persuade him of anything. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for an emotional response he could work with. I didn't give him one. I understand that you're confused, I said evenly, but my clarity doesn't depend on your understanding. That was the moment his posture changed. People often expect confrontation to be about accusation, about unloading pain, about finally being heard. but I had already done my processing privately. What remained was alignment. He tried to explain the affair in fragments, not excuses exactly, but contextualizations, stress, connection, distance that had just happened. I didn't challenge the details. I didn't argue timelines. I didn't correct his framing. Instead, I said the only part that mattered. You brought another woman into a space that was meant to be safe for our child, I said. You did it publicly, and you did it without speaking to me. He started to respond. I raised my hand. Not sharply, just enough to pause him. I'm not asking you to explain, I continued. I'm telling you what that meant to me. I let the silence sit. That wasn't a misunderstanding, I said. It was a line. His face shifted then. Not with anger, but with something closer to realization. Not guilt. Recognition. He asked if there was anything he could do. It was an honest question. Late, but honest. I answered it honestly. No, I said, not now. I didn't say it coldly. I didn't say it to wound him. I said it the way you state a fact you've already accepted. He searched my face, looking for hesitation, for softness, for an opening. There wasn't one. I explained what would happen next, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as information. Changes in structure, in expectations, in our shared arrangements, all communicated without blame. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't negotiate terms. I didn't revisit history. I wasn't ending the relationship in that moment. I was acknowledging that it had already ended, quietly, some time ago. The conversation lasted less than an hour. When it ended, there was no dramatic exit. We cleared the table, turned off the lights, spoke about logistics regarding our child. It was almost unsettling how calm it was. But calm doesn't mean easy. It means final, because confrontation without heat leaves nothing to argue against, no emotion to deflect, no tone to criticize, no behavior to pathologize. Only truth, stated plainly. And that night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without rehearsing anything I wished I had said. After everything settled into its new shape, life didn't suddenly feel easier, but it felt honest. There is a difference between relief and alignment. Relief is light and fleeting. Alignment is heavier, but stable. It doesn't lift you up, it roots you down. That rootedness is what I live with now. I no longer wake up bracing myself for subtle disappointments I haven't named yet. I no longer scan conversations for emotional undercurrents I'm expected to manage. The background noise, the constant low-level vigilance that came from being the reasonable one, has gone quiet. Not because life is perfect, but because my internal signals are no longer ignored. I am still calm, still measured, still thoughtful. Those qualities were never the problem. What changed is that I no longer offer them as proof of my worth. Before, my composure was something others benefited from more than I did. It made me easy to lean on, easy to overlook, easy to take for granted. I mistook being needed for being respected, and for a long time, I accepted the trade. I don't anymore. Now, calm is something I own, not something I spend. I choose when it's appropriate. I choose who receives it. And I notice immediately when someone tries to take it without permission. I am no longer impressed by familiarity masquerading as intimacy. I am no longer convinced by gestures that arrive without accountability. And I am no longer interested in relationships, romantic or otherwise, that rely on my silence to function. That shift has changed how people interact with me. Some lean in more carefully now. They listen differently. They pause before assuming. Others drift away, not dramatically, just gradually, when they realize I won't resume the role of emotional buffer or quiet fixer. Both outcomes are information. I used to fear that enforcing boundaries would make me cold or unapproachable. What I've learned instead is that boundaries clarify relationships. They don't destroy healthy ones. They expose unhealthy dynamics that depend on your self-neglect. At school events, I move through the space differently now. I don't scan for where I should sit or who might expect something from me. I sit where I can see clearly. I speak when it matters. I leave when it's time. If I'm acknowledged, I respond warmly. If I'm ignored, I don't compensate. That alone has changed the tone of many interactions. Professionally, I've noticed a similar shift. I no longer over-explain. I don't preemptively soften my competence to make it more digestible. I let my work stand as it is, precise, thorough, unapologetic. It's remarkable how quickly people adjust when you stop shrinking in anticipation of their comfort. Motherhood, too, feels different now. Not in devotion, but in modeling. I'm more conscious of what I demonstrate through my actions, not what I say about self-respect, but how I live it. I show my child that kindness doesn't require self-erasure, that calm doesn't mean compliance, that walking away from disrespect can be quiet and still be powerful. There is no bitterness in me. That's important to say because bitterness would suggest I'm still tied to an outcome I didn't get, still measuring myself against someone else's failure. I'm not. What I carry is discernment. Discernment allows me to remember the past without reliving it, to tell the truth without dramatizing it, to acknowledge loss without romanticizing endurance. I don't need to punish anyone to validate what happened. I don't need public acknowledgement to confirm my reality. The need to be seen has been replaced by the ability to see clearly. And that is far more useful. I trust myself now in a way I didn't before, not because I'm stronger, but because I'm more honest. I no longer override my internal warnings for the sake of harmony. I don't second-guess discomfort just because it's inconvenient. I listen. That self-trust extends outward. I don't rush intimacy. I don't fill silences reflexively. I allow people to reveal themselves at their own pace, and I believe what I observe. The most profound change is this. I no longer measure my value by how well I endure. Endurance is not a virtue when it replaces self-respect. I don't admire how much someone can tolerate anymore. I admire clarity, consistency, accountability, emotional maturity that doesn't require an audience. If someone underestimates me now, I don't rush to correct them. I don't posture. I don't perform. I let time do the work because I know who I am. I am a woman who noticed the moment respect shifted and chose not to argue about it. I am a woman who enforced a boundary without spectacle. I am a woman who walked away internally long before she ever did structurally. And I am a woman who understands that quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about self-love. Once you develop that, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to win narratives. You don't need to be believed by everyone. You just need to keep choosing yourself calmly, consistently, without apology. That's who I am now, and I don't disappear anymore. There is a version of this story that could have been louder. It could have ended with exposure, confrontation in public spaces, and raised voices that finally forced everyone to look. That version exists in many people's imagination of justice, where harm is answered with spectacle and pain is validated only when it becomes undeniable to others. But that was never the justice I was looking for. What I wanted, what I needed, was to walk away without losing myself. Because the most serious damage wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the moment he brought another woman into our child's school event, crossing a line that should have been obvious without explanation. The most serious damage would have been staying silent after recognizing what that choice meant. Some lines should never be crossed, not because people are incapable of change, but because crossing them reveals something essential about how power, entitlement, and respect are understood. When someone believes they can publicly erase you from a space tied to your child, they are no longer confused about boundaries. They are confident you won't enforce them. That confidence is what ends relationships long before paperwork ever does. What I learned through all of this is something I wish more people were told early, without shame or fear. You don't owe anyone a dramatic reaction in order to justify a decisive response. You don't need to collapse, scream, or explain your pain in detail for it to be real. You don't need to prove how much something hurts in order to decide it's unacceptable. Quiet decisions still change lives. Walking away internally before the world knows you're leaving is not cowardice. It's preparation. It's clarity. It's choosing to protect what matters without feeding what harmed you. There was no moment where he suddenly became the villain and I became the hero. That kind of framing flattens reality. People are more complicated than that. But clarity doesn't require villains. It only requires honesty. I was honest with myself about what I could live with, honest about what I could model for my child, honest about the cost of staying silent after silence had already been mistaken for consent. And once that honesty settled in, everything else followed naturally. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this. Calm does not obligate you to tolerate disrespect. You can be composed and still decisive, empathetic and still done, quiet and still powerful. And if you're listening to this while sitting in your own silence, telling yourself it's not bad enough yet, or that you'll speak up when it becomes undeniable, I want you to hear this gently. You don't need permission to take yourself seriously. Awareness comes before action. Clarity comes before change. And self-loyalty often begins in moments no one else notices. Before we end, I want to open the conversation to you. Have you ever reached a point where you didn't need to argue anymore? Where you simply knew something was over, even if the world hadn't caught up yet? If you're comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Not for validation, but because someone else may recognize themselves in your quiet turning point. Thank you for being here.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.